The children at St. Clement's College knew one thing for certain. When the lights went out and the night grew still, you never ignored the sound of high heels echoing in the halls. They said it was Mrs. Koi Koi, the ghost of a woman who never stopped searching for revenge. The dim glow of the lanterns flickered against the cracked walls of Hillcrest Girls' Boarding School. The air carried a chill that pricked at the skin of anyone still awake. Midnight was near, and the only sound in the dormitory was the rhythmic hum of crickets outside. It was Amaka's first term at Hillcrest, and though she had heard the tales of Mrs. Koi Koi from her elder sister, she dismissed them as stories meant to scare junior students. That was until she heard it herself, the faint koi koi of high heels echoing through the silent corridors on her second week. That night, Amaka lay in her bunk, surrounded by 30 other girls, all asleep. The room was quiet except for the occasional snore. She was staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep, when the noise came again. Faint, deliberate, and unmistakable. Koi, koi. Amaka's breath hitched. She sat up, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound seemed to come closer with each step. She glanced at her bunkmate, Ifeoma, who snored softly, oblivious to the eerie noise. Amaka leaned down to shake her awake, but Ifeoma groaned and turned away. Koi, koi. The footsteps stopped just outside the dormitory door. "Did you hear that?" Amaka whispered, her voice barely audible. A girl in the bunk across from her stirred, but didn't respond. Suddenly, the door creaked open, just a fraction. A shadow moved in the faint moonlight streaming through the window. Amaka's chest tightened as she froze, her eyes fixed on the door. The lantern flickered again, and for a brief moment, she thought she saw the outline of a woman, a figure clad in red, with glossy black hair that seemed to flow unnaturally. And then she heard it, the distinct koi koi of heels stepping into the dormitory. Amaka wasn't the only one awake anymore. A stifled gasp came from the far corner of the room. Someone whispered, "It's her, Mrs. Koi Koi." The name sent shivers down Amaka's spine. The legend was true. Mrs. Koi Koi's footsteps grew louder, echoing in the confined space. The sound wasn't just footsteps. It carried an eerie rhythm, as though mocking the terrified girls. The air turned icy, and the once distant crickets had gone silent. Amaka pulled her blanket over her head, praying the figure wouldn't come closer. But curiosity got the better of her. She peeked through a small gap in her blanket. The woman in red was there, her face partially hidden in shadows. What Amaka could see was horrifying. Her lips, bright red, stretched into an unnatural grin. Her eyes gleamed with malice, and her high heels, impossibly shiny, clicked against the floor as she moved. One girl let out a scream. Mrs. Koi Koi turned sharply toward the sound, her grin widening. The lanterns flickered and went out completely, plunging the room into darkness. Chaos erupted as girls leapt from their bunks, screaming and colliding with one another, desperate to escape. Amaka grabbed Ifeoma's hand and bolted for the door. The sound of heels chased them, koi koi, louder and faster, as though the ghost was right behind them. As they reached the corridor, Amaka risked a glance back and saw the woman's red dress glowing faintly in the dark, her grin still visible. The two girls didn't stop running until they reached the assembly hall, where other students and a teacher had gathered, awakened by the commotion. They tried to explain what they had seen, but the teacher dismissed it as a nightmare shared by hysterical children. But Amaka knew what she had seen, and as the weeks went by, the koi koi sound returned, sometimes faint, sometimes loud, reminding everyone at Hillcrest Girls' Boarding School that Mrs. Koi Koi was far from gone. Days passed, and Hillcrest seemed to return to normal, at least on the surface. But Amaka couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her. Every creak of the wooden floors, every gust of wind, every flicker of light made her heart race. The other girls spoke in hushed whispers, but no one dared to mention Mrs. Koi Koi again, as if ignoring the legend might keep it at bay. But the footsteps never stopped. At night, Amaka would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the haunting koi koi echo through the halls. It was always faint, always distant, but it was never gone. Each time, the sound seemed to inch closer, like a promise that couldn't be ignored. One night, weeks after the terrifying event, Amaka was unable to sleep again. She could hear the others breathing softly in their sleep. The room settled in darkness. But then once again, koi koi. She tensed, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was unmistakable, and this time it wasn't distant. It was close, very close. She sat up and looked toward the door. The shadow of Mrs. Koi Koi crossed her mind, the woman in red with the unnatural grin. But there was something else in Amaka's heart, something that had changed in the weeks that followed. It was more than fear now. It was a strange pull, a need to confront what haunted her, to understand the source of this madness. As if on cue, the door creaked open. The shadow moved again, but this time, Amaka was ready. She rose from her bunk, quietly, so as not to wake the others. Her heart pounded, but her feet were steady. She grabbed a flashlight from her bag and tiptoed toward the door, carefully easing it open. Her eyes searched the hallway. The footsteps continued, closer now. She felt the chill in the air, a thick, suffocating cold that made the hairs on her neck stand up. She crept toward the source of the sound. At the end of the hall, she saw the figure. Mrs. Koi Koi. The woman stood in the dark, her red dress glowing faintly in the dim light of Amaka's flashlight. Her black hair shimmered, flowing as if caught in a phantom breeze. Her grin, stretched and distorted, flickered as she turned toward Amaka, her malicious eyes gleaming in the darkness. Amaka's pulse thundered in her ears as the ghostly woman took a slow step forward. The koi koi of her heels rang louder with every movement, as though time itself had slowed, but Amaka didn't move. She had to know. The figure stopped before her. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had gone still. Mrs. Koi Koi's smile remained wide, almost too wide. Her voice, soft but chilling, broke the silence. "Why do you follow me, child?" she whispered, her voice like ice scraping against stone. Amaka's voice trembled, but she forced the words out. "Who are you? Why are you here?" The woman's grin faltered for just a moment, before she slowly tilted her head. "I am the forgotten, the ones you laugh at, the ones you fear, the ones who never find peace." She stepped closer, her presence overwhelming. "And you are the one who will set me free?" Amaka's heart froze in her chest. She had heard stories of restless spirits seeking vengeance, but this was different. Mrs. Koi Koi wasn't angry. She was desperate. A ghost tied to something deeper than revenge. She had been wronged, betrayed by the very institution that now housed Amaka. And now, Amaka understood. She was not a mere victim. She was the key. Before Amaka could speak, Mrs. Koi Koi reached out with icy hands, brushing her fingers against Amaka's forehead. Her vision blurred, and she saw flashes, fragments of the past, of a woman once a student here, wrongfully accused, silenced by those in power. Her life had ended in sorrow, and her spirit had been trapped, bound to the school by the injustice done to her. Amaka gasped, her body trembling. She could feel the woman's pain, her anger, her longing for release. Mrs. Koi Koi wasn't here to haunt. She was here to find justice. In that moment, Amaka knew what had to be done. She didn't know how, but she could feel it in her bones. The school's history had been hidden, and the truth was buried. She had to uncover it, to right the wrongs and give Mrs. Koi Koi the peace she deserved. The ghost's smile softened, and she whispered, "You will set me free, child. You will speak the truth." With those words, she vanished into the dark, leaving only a faint scent of roses behind. The footsteps stopped. Amaka stood alone in the hallway, her heart still racing. But now, there was a quiet calm inside her. Mrs. Koi Koi's presence lingered, but the terror was gone. The legend had been broken, not by running or hiding, but by seeking the truth. As the days passed, Amaka began to investigate the school's hidden history. She dug into old records, speaking to the staff and even the older students who had heard whispers of the tragedy. Slowly, the pieces came together, revealing a story of betrayal and injustice that had long been swept under the rug. When the truth finally came to light, the school was forced to acknowledge the wrongs done to the woman known as Mrs. Koi Koi. Her name was cleared, and her spirit, at last, was laid to rest. The footsteps never returned, but sometimes, late at night, when the lanterns flicker and the wind stirs the trees, the faint sound of Koi Koi can still be heard. But now it is not a warning. It is a gentle reminder. Some legends are not meant to be feared, they are meant to be understood. I hope you enjoyed the story. Thank you all so much for watching. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment.